Good morning, everybody. It is a nice day down here in Tallahassee, Florida, and I am going to make a movie here about things to look for when buying your first old motorcycle. Now, if you're anything like me, you probably want to buy the first bike that you see, and that bike could very well end up having a seized engine. So there are a couple of things that you want to look for, a couple of things that you want to see on this bike. This here is a good example. A friend brought this over to me for me to help him get it running. It is a 1977 Honda CB550. He recently bought it. It was his first bike, and I'm just going to use it as an example of certain things to look for when purchasing your motorcycle. Now, this list of things should by no means be considered exhaustive. It's always a good idea to, before you go and see your bike, go on certain forums or look online for things that people are saying about this bike, because they'll know better than I would about certain motorcycle brand specific issues that you should look for. I can give you a general overview on how to size up a bike and determine its worth, but for more specific ones, once you found a bike online on Craigslist or eBay or whatever, you should probably go online and research it first. Next step is really just figuring out what kind of bike do you want. There are some people who wouldn't be caught dead on a cafe racer like this, or some people who prefer them. Don't buy a bike just because it's within your price range. If you're going to feel uncomfortable on this bike, or if it's not what you want to use it for, don't buy it. Okay, now, so let's assume that you have decided that you want an old Honda cafe racer, and you contacted someone with an ad online, and you came and you arrived at the bike. What should you do? Well, the very first thing you should do right after hopping out of the car is run up and touch the engine like this. The engine should be cold. If the engine has been warmed up, then the previous owner knows that the bike has some issues, and he knows that the bike starts better while it's hot. So he warmed up the bike in an attempt to fool you into thinking that it was a well-running motorcycle. If the engine is warmed up, I strongly suggest that you tell that owner that you want to start the engine while it's cold and come back another day. Next, look at the title for the bike. That can tell you a lot of very important things. For example, is the guy who is selling it on the title? Also, it can tell you the last time it was titled and the mileage. So, if it was last titled in, say, 1990, and the mileage was only 9,000 miles, and here you can see that the mileage is only 10,730 miles, then this bike has only been ridden 1,000 miles in, almost over 20 years. That's not such a good sign. If a bike has been sitting, that's probably the worst thing you can do for a bike. If it's been sitting in a garage or in a barn or under a tarp or whatever. I'd much rather buy a bike that has 40 or 50,000 miles that has been ridden steadily its entire life than a bike that only has 5 or 10,000 miles and then sat for a long time. Okay, now as for the condition of the bike, start out with the tires. Do they look worn down or cracked at all? These tires here, they look pretty good, even though they're a little bit old. You don't see any sign of dry rotting on them. Look at the back tire here. This back tire looks a little bit worn, but it's still pretty serviceable. You can see it's still got some pretty good tread. That's pretty good. If one of your tires comes apart at high speeds, it's a much more serious problem than it is on an automobile. Now inspect the chain if your bike has one. Some bikes have drive shafts. I much prefer them, but this one has a chain. When my friend bought this bike, this little clip right here was missing. And the chain was basically just held together by luck. You want to look for stuff like that. You definitely don't want your chain to come off when you're riding your bike home for the first time. Also inspect the chain for rust. This chain is getting a little bit rusty, but it's still in pretty good shape. You may want to replace it. This is the rear sprocket that connects the chain to the wheel. You should check out the teeth on your sprocket and make sure they're not too worn down. Make sure their edges are still pretty sharp. This bike is kind of funny because it's had some electricals replaced by common parts that you'd find at a Home Depot. For example, this here, that's the starter. Your main switch is hidden all the way back here. I would take that as a bad sign. It tells me that this bike was probably stolen once in its life and had its ignition punched out, and then it was acquired and repaired by someone who really didn't know what they were doing, or really didn't want to give the time and care to do a good job. I would say that this is probably something that indicates how this bike has been cared for its entire life, and it would raise a red flag for me. Now we want to look for signs that this bike has been down or crashed. I would start right here at these flares here, these on the engine, these cooling flares. Usually they get cracked if this bike has been down at any type of speed. These don't seem to be, which could indicate A, that it has never been down, or B, that it's a different engine. However, here on this cover here we have some scrapes. These scrapes go up and down, so they don't really appear as though they were part of a crash. Maybe this bike just fell over or something knocked into it. If the scrapes went side to side, then it was probably part of a crash. However, take a look here. This brake lever here has been broken off. That probably means it was part of a crash. Also, this cover here has been replaced. It's much shinier than everything else on the bike. So that can tell you that this bike probably went down on the right-hand side. Now take a look at your exhaust pipes here. These ones are a little bit harder to tell because they're black. Most motorcycle exhaust pipes are a chrome color, but you can still look for discoloration in the pipes coming directly out of the engine. If your pipes are discolored, it could probably mean that your motorcycle has been burning lean for a long time, which indicates a much higher engine burning temperature, and that could bode ill for other parts of your engine. These ones here, it's kind of hard to tell. They're definitely a little bit rustier here, which means that this black material has been heated and flaked off and is causing rust. I would take this as an indication that the bike has not been properly tuned for a long time. Look underneath the engine where the bike is normally kept and look for spots on the ground like engine oil leakage or other fluids. Make sure all your lights work, including turn signals, which this bike doesn't have, and your brake light. Touch your rotors and feel for signs of scouring. If your bike was ridden with a brake pad that was severely worn down, it could be scoured. Also see if it's warped in any way. If it's scoured or warped, it would definitely want replacement. Check for missing bolts, like this headlight bolt. Look for any replaced parts, especially body parts. This little piece of linkage here seems to be new and replaced, but that can also be misleading because this is a cafe racer and a lot of guys need to change the angle of their shifter and their brake lever. So it might be replaced anyway. It doesn't necessarily mean it was worn out. But you'd want to look for anything that's been replaced that is obviously newer, shinier, or anything like that. Because if a part was replaced, it can also mean that other parts near it are ready to go. Look inside your gas tank and look for severe rust. A little bit of rust inside of a tank that's almost 40 years old is pretty common, but a lot of rust is going to want to have to get cleaned out before you ride it for too long. Finally, you're going to want to look at your carburetors here. They've got these little brass plugs on this model. Unscrew one of them and open it up and see what kind of gasoline comes out. If the gasoline is nice and clear, then it's probably pretty okay in there. If the gasoline comes out and it's discolored or there's chunks coming out, then you're definitely going to want to have to clean your carburetors. If you don't know how to do it yourself, that can get pretty costly.